Joining us now is Chief Economist at the Institute of Public Affairs, Adam Creighton. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. I want to get your thoughts on the media's reaction to the Trump administration's decision to welcome a group of 59 white South African refugees because they are facing violence and discrimination at home. Now, the left-wing media seem to be panicking about this, and there were even suggestions on Don Lemon's podcast that farmers that are coming in could be replacing farmers here in America. Take a listen to this.
The white Afrikaners who were allowed into the country and what that means for the black folks and the black farmers, what's going to end up, and the black farmers who've lost so much land over the decades here in the United States because of the racist policies. What does this do? What does this mean? When you see this, what do you think?
Well, Don, this is a slap in the face to America's black farmers right now. Here you have the President of the United States flying in white farmers.
And it's not just on that podcast, on outlets like MSNBC. There's just so much of that type of language getting thrown out there. It seems that there's a bit of a double standard here. There were no problems when there was Joe Biden's open border policy, letting in millions of illegals crossing the border. But now that we have 59 refugees from South Africa, well, that's alarming.
Yeah, look, it is just hilarious. As you say, there've been at least 5 million migrants pour into the United States during the Biden administration, depending on what figures you look at, and the left largely celebrated that in the US. They certainly didn't complain, and it just is laughable that these 59 white farmers from South Africa, which I understand have been granted refugee status, will be allowed in the US, and they do suffer persecution, as I understand it, back in South Africa. So I think it's perfectly valid of the US to let them in. I mean, I think probably the left's angry about it because these 59 farmers probably would end up voting for the Republican Party if they ever became US citizens. And, maybe this is too cynical, but I think the reason the left generally likes huge amounts of immigration is because those immigrants tend to support the Democrat Party eventually.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. Look, I want to talk to you about the trade war. Right now, global stock markets are soaring in the wake of the trade truce between the US and China. Now, the agreement implements a 90-day cooling off period, bringing a temporary end to the trade war. So US tariffs on Chinese imports, which were jacked up to 145% last month, will be scaled down to 30%, and Beijing lowered its tariffs from 125% to just 10%. Now, this is what Donald Trump has had to say about dealing with China.
One of the things I think that could be most exciting for us and also for China is that we're trying to open up China because, as you know, many years ago we opened up the USA. Now it's time for China to open up, and that's part of our deal. And we're going to open up China. To me, that's the most exciting part. But yeah, we made a deal. The relationship is very good. I've always had a good relationship with President Xi. It was interrupted because of COVID, obviously. But outside of that, I've always had a great relationship, a lot of respect for him. And we'll see how that all works out. But we have the confines of a very, very strong deal with China. But the most exciting part of the deal, it was mentioned, but we don't talk about it yet. That's the opening up of China to U.S. business. And that would be like opening up a whole new world. And I think it would be even better for China.
Adam, what's your assessment of where this is at the moment?
Well, look, I think the fact that there's a deal is fantastic. Okay, it's only 90 days, but if you go back a month or so, I think most commentators thought the world was practically going to end with all the discussion of the tariffs. But both the Chinese and the Americans have been sensible and pragmatic, and they've reduced those tariffs from, as you say, 3 figures to 2 figures. I think 30% tariffs now on Chinese goods going into the US and 20% the other way. So they are significantly higher, but obviously much, much lower. And trade will continue between the two countries. This is great for Australia too, of course, because China obviously buys a lot of our exports, and things that are bad for the Chinese economy are certainly bad for the Australian economy too. So we should celebrate that here. But the point that Trump makes there is broadly right. The US has been fairly conducive to free trade for a very long time, and other countries are not. The places like China and also the European Union have imposed a whole array of tariff and non-tariff barriers on American goods. And so the US president, has every right to be frustrated by those and to seek their removal.
And as you say, just a month ago, it was as if the world was ending. And it's always good to have your perspective here on Power Hour because so much of the mainstream media were freaking out.
I was right.
That's right. Is it too early to say you were right? Look, let's just go back 4 weeks and look at some of the headlines and the messages that we were being told. In The Economist that had the headline, President Trump's mindless tariffs will cause economic havoc. And if you listen to the Democrats, well, this is what Elizabeth Warren claimed would happen to the economy.
Comes in and basically starts the dumbest trade war in the history of this country. This is going to be about potentially millions of people losing their jobs. It's going to be about millions of people losing their savings, many of people losing their retirement security, and at the same time taking on even higher costs for everything they buy. So that's going to push us in potentially to foreclosures or people being pushed out of their apartments. You know, I remember this from 2008 and how long it took us to dig our way out. And to this day, there are families, there are communities that still haven't recovered. Recessions can be all those fancy charts and graphs, but at the end of the day, people feel them one person at a time, and they can be devastating.
Adam, and in just a matter of weeks, we've seen the stock market recover. We've seen a deal being done. You know, you were right.
Yeah, look, the jobless rate in the US is still very low, as I understand it, below 5%, I think. As you say, the stock market's been booming again. Look, it's early days. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I mean, clearly forecasts like that have just been proved hopelessly wrong so far. I mean, as a general rule, things are never quite as bad or good as they seem. That's kind of my philosophy in life. So, you know, when you see hysteria, it's probably misplaced. And we certainly saw a lot of that in relation to these deals. So, look, let's just wait and see. It's not only the US and China that have a deal. The US and the UK have a deal, I understand. So I think what we're going to see US tariffs settle around the 10 to 30% mark on most countries, and it's going to be effectively a revenue raiser for the US government. And they may use some of that revenue to try to cut income taxes. We have to wait and see. But look, it's not going to be as disastrous as some people thought.
Oh, great to have your perspective as always. And look, also let's talk about US inflation data that is in. Inflation was softer than expected in April, slowing to its lowest rate in more than 4 years. The consumer prices rose 2.3% in April from a year earlier, which is the lowest annual inflation reading since 2021. Now, this has sparked a fresh push, I guess, from President Trump to see interest rates slashed. What do you make of it?
Well, look, firstly, this is quite funny too, because that was the month where the huge tariffs came in and inflation was supposed to explode, but actually inflation went down. So it's kind of funny, right? So inflation is basically in the US where it should be, between 2 and 3%. There's no worrying signs yet. You know, Trump, for all of his life, all of his career, has always been for lower interest rates, and he likes to badger the Fed to lower rates. You know, that is ultimately up to the Fed in the US, just like it's up to the RBA here to change interest rates independently. So we'll just wait and see what they do. They will probably cut them, I would say. Central banks have a proclivity, basically an inclination to cut rates when they can. And if there's no inflation, they will typically cut them. So when the US cuts, we'll probably see cuts here in Australia too. So that's good.
Okay.
With home loans.
Absolutely. Finally, I want to get your thoughts on Donald Trump's trip to the Middle East. We've seen Saudi Arabia commit to investing $600 billion in the US in a deal that's set to strengthen America's energy, security, defence industry and access to global infrastructure. Qatar Airways has signed a deal worth more than $200 billion for the purchase of more than 150 Boeing jets. Now, the president has celebrated the deal as the biggest in Boeing's history. You know, what's your assessment of the president's tour in the Middle East and the deals that he's been able to do?
Well, these deals are great for US corporations. I mean, he thinks of himself as a great deal maker, and he's made some great deals here. I think the more general point is it's good that he's visiting these Arabic countries. I mean, he's visiting the president of Syria. These were largely no-go zones for previous presidents, but he's being very pragmatic, I think, in world affairs. He's dealing with Israel, he's dealing with the Arab countries, he's dealing with Russia, he's dealing with Ukraine. I mean, he wants to be a peace president, I think, and I think that it's good that he's out there meeting people. From what I hear, Trump in person is very personable and likable, and I think that's worked in Saudi Arabia. You can see it.
Adam Creighton, Chief Economist at the Institute of Public Affairs. Thank you so much for your time. Love having you on Power Hour.
Thanks for having me.